Hello, children. You ever struggle learning the intricacies of an Oriental language and find it especially difficult learning how the characters work? Well, today I'm going to be teaching you how we got to this point, why Chinese characters look like this instead of this, or why Vietnamese use this instead of this. Before we start, here's a disclaimer. 8,000 years of history from like 20 countries will be condensed into a 10-ish minute YouTube video, so much of what I'm going to be saying will be dumbed down and simplified for entertainment value. Please don't use this video as a source. That's pretty much it. Smash that like button. So we first start our Hanzi journey with the Oracle bone script used around the Shang dynasty of China. Were there earlier scripts? Maybe. It's likely that history goes back even further. We just haven't found any evidence to back this up though. Anyways, this era scripts are known to be caveman pictographs of existing stuff like animals, land, numbers, basically anything that's just common human knowledge. That's not all. Even in this era, concepts such as up, down, strength, rest, bride, etc. were also invented by arranging lines, drawing tools, or arranging other characters to form an idea. The reason why it's called Oracle Bone Script is that a long time ago, people used to talk with God by grabbing some bones, carve some shit you want to ask to it, throw it into a fire until cracks form, and fortune tellers interpret the cracks into some kind of destiny manifest. And now thousands of years later, that's where we mostly find them. So yeah, Oracle Bone Script. Next is Chinese bronze inscriptions, where Hanzis grow thicker and more abstract because of the invention of bronze. Characters were casted directly onto bells, pots, and cauldrons, and as such, the scripts evolved from being more carvable to being more castable. Now there's technically multiple generations of CBI that encompasses thousands of years and regional variations. Most famous among them is the Zhou scripts, which they use for ceremonial purposes. But at this stage, the characters are still too unreadable to the untrained eye, so we're going to move on to the Warring States period. So basically during this time, there was a huge civil war going on in China, right? Not even AD yet. And all these different kingdoms have different writing systems. You got Qin, Han, Zhao, Yan, Wei, Qi, and Chu. Look how each of them write the letter horse. Pop quiz, can you tell just by analyzing them which kingdom won? Tick, 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 tick. Yes, you're right, it's the Qin. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, was basically a great reformer. He's the guy responsible for the terracotta people, expanding the Great Wall, and drinking the immortality potion that ironically killed him. Anyways, he standardized and upgraded the Chinese script to his kingdoms, which then evolved into small seal script. You can tell just by seeing the comparisons I'm putting on the screen right now that A, they prioritized symmetry and got rid of chunks, B, they simplified it to what we're familiar with today, and C, they fucking banned regional characters. RFP Horses 2-7, gone and forgotten. Also, 3 things you're probably wondering right now. Hey, I swear I've seen these characters from somewhere. That's because this script is actually still used today in things like stamps, passports, and even white people tattoos, believe it or not. Hey, if that's small seal script, then where's large seal script? Well, it does exist as an older, broader, more complex version, but it's more or less just irrelevant, so I'm not going to talk about it. And also, why is it called seal script? It's called that because even after the next update dropped, it was still used as seals for ceremonial inscriptions, hence the name. Next in line is the Clerical script. It came into existence because people needed a writing system more easier and simpler to write. Now we're at the point where we could actually start reading some of these. You see how in the timeline Clerical script overlaps with the small seal script? It was invented early on for merchants as a simplification of the more royal seal script, but as time went on, it just kind of took over as the dominant script. Cause compared to 2, bruh, clerics got families to feed. They can't just spend all their time getting all the details on bone right. We need to cut corners, and that's what they did. If you feel like you've seen these before, in Japan, we have them on money. Okay, now we're at a point where simplification becomes a problem. Cursive script was invented to be even faster writing Chinese characters, getting rid of, well, basically everything sensible and intelligible about Chinese characters. In English, it's called cursive script because, well, duh, it's made out of cursive. But in Chinese, it uses the character for grass to make grass script. Why? Because the script flows with a mystical grace, like a patch of grass swaying gently in the embrace of a soft whispering breeze. And just kidding, in Chinese, grass also means sloppy. So yeah, even experts consider this terrible. Try to make out what this says. 3, 2, 1. Wrong, it's the Hanzi for time. How about this? 3, 2, 1. Nah, bruh, that's a dragon. This one? 3, 2, 1. Of course not, stupid. It's actually rose. What about this one? Whoever answers it first, I pin their comment. Around the same time or a century later, depending on who you ask, semi-cursive script emerged for the same reason, but it's slightly more intelligible. If you're a lazy piece of shit like me, you probably also unintentionally use this script style, because all it is just normal kanji without lifting your pen technically. Both of these are really just fonts, and regular scripts were still being used during these eras, but it's important to talk about because they're still being used today in like calligraphy class, history class, and will be relevant again when we talk about Japan and modern day China. And finally, we're at regular script, which is still technically being used today. It was invented as a more proper version of the clerical script with a teensy bit of semi-cursive script characteristics, so now it evolved towards a clean, tall style that's easier to write and read, the ultimate script. It at first looked like an early beta release, but as time went on, it more or less transformed into what we know today. By the year 800, it was pretty much fully established and unified all over Tang. So that's more or less the evolution of Hanzi. Now let's see how other countries adopt Chinese characters. We'll first start our journey with modern day China, because now the script's evolution has split into two, standard Chinese and traditional Chinese. In mainland China, they speak Mandarin and use standard Chinese, but in Taiwan, they speak Mandarin but use traditional Chinese. We'll talk about Hokkien in a different episode, don't worry. Simplified characters were invented by Big Brother CCP to make it easier to read and write. Apparently in the 50s, because of a lack of education, the complexities of written Chinese, and my ancestors, literacy was incredibly low. But due to the efforts of Mao, I guess, it's not an issue anymore. This is good and all, but simplified Chinese looks a little strange, right? Look at horse for example. Yeah, I guess it's easier to read and write, but holy shit, it is uncanny. How about the Hanzi for bell? Look, not only did they simplify the gold radical, but they also simplified the do part because not only is it a well-known Hanzi that makes the same sound roughly, but it's also easier to write. And there's also like 100 more changes based on like 20 different factors, either replacing some radical with an easier equivalent or just removing them altogether. The cool thing is that most of them has origins from cursive scripts, so I guess it's not all artificial. Cantonese though, they're a language that primarily uses traditional Chinese characters. So most Cantonese speaking places, Hong Kong, Macau, San Francisco, they use traditional Chinese characters for the writing system. Traditional Chinese is like the OG Chinese characters. All other foreign Hanzi systems are descendants of this writing system. And as such, the characters themselves has been largely unmodified since the Middle Ages. And that's why it's one of the most difficult writing systems out there. Look at the Hanzi for turtle. How anyone can casually write this baffles me. How about gangs? Damn, that's hard. How about salt? What the hell even is this? You're probably wondering, well, how do they write modern words like, say, cell phone, Idaho, or Oganesson if they don't have syllabic writing? Well, what they do in cases like cell phone is that they'll get a brief description of the item, grab already existing Hanzis, and combine them to get the new word. Pretty similar to English actually, both just recycling words into new ones. Words like Idaho, where you really can't get a description that's not vague, you transliterate it into Chinese characters. Idaho. And the guy in charge of choosing the Hanzi, whether that be the government, news channels, or anybody else, will most likely use more common Hanzis instead of rare ones. Rarely they'll invent new Hanzis for new words, but when they do, it'll make sense, like Nihonium, epilepsy, Bianbianmen, whatever. Now let's talk about Japan, which uses 3 types of writing systems for one language: kanji, hiragana, and katakana. So Japan was first bestowed upon this great writing system around the 1st century when Chinese traders started importing letters, coins, and seals with Chinese written on them. There's evidence that we didn't have a fucking clue what these squiggly lines were until around the 5th century when we started to adopt the writing system used for Japanese. According to the Nihon Shoki, we talked about this book in the last episode, a scholar that probably existed was sent to Biek to bring home knowledge of Confucianism and Chinese characters allegedly, and ever since then, additional diplomatic missions brought Japanese into a fully developed language per se. During the Asuka period, a new type of writing system started to emerge, but instead of being logographic like Chinese or hieroglyphic, alphabetic like German or Hungarian, abugida like Hindi or Amharic, this new script is syllabic, meaning each letter represents a symbol. This script, called Manyogana, is essentially just Chinese characters that were used for the sounds they produced and nothing else. They were invented because Chinese characters weren't enough to transcribe Japanese without issues in grammar. Here, take a look at this script for a second. Some of you might already be connecting the dots to where this is going, and the other half is lost in a sea of pain. A few centuries later, this script would later evolve into 2 other syllabic scripts plus 1 forbidden script. First came katakana during the Heian period, which was invented by Buddhist monks to translate foreign texts better. And just a bit later, hiragana was invented, not because of a need to translate or inscribe text, but because women thought regular texts were not cute enough. Yes, I'm being serious. It turns out men fucking hated using it because it was girly, so for a long time it was used only by women. This habit stuck around until Edo-ish, until usage became kind of broad. Everyone knew how to use kanji, hiragana, and katakana from this point on. But fun fact, hiragana wasn't allowed to be used in government because duh, no girls allowed. It wasn't until fucking less than 100 years ago when they reformed it, and now the system's the same as everywhere else in Japan.
Hey Maruhi, aren't you forgetting something?
You're right, I am. Hentai kana is not something gross, but just variants of other kana types that were flushed away with westernization. You know how there's two ways of writing the letter A in English? Now just imagine that, but needlessly complicated and makes you want to die. Look on its Wikipedia page, they just show up as Unicode. That's how useless they are today. 3 things you're probably thinking: who invented them? Probably women calligraphers mostly. Why invent them? Well, they were invented for writing to be even more fluid and artistic than they already are. But because there was no standardization, variations popped up depending on the writer, region, era, or whichever kanji that kana derives from. And why did they get rid of it? Just look at it, bruh. Of course they get rid of it with Meiji standardization. If I had to learn that shit in school, I would have become a terrorist. You see, hentai kana has individual rules that surround them, just like wo, wa, e, or any other particle. If they still existed outside of restaurant names, Japanese would be the most difficult language in the world, period. Between Heian and Edo, kanji evolved relatively to what we know today. The last major update they did to the kanji system was the simplification of many complicated characters. That's why traditional Chinese, standard Chinese, and Japanese sometimes have 3 completely separate kanji writing systems for what once was the same thing. Now let's talk about Korea, who, fun fact, speaks Korean, believe it or not. So like Japan, Korea had a history of using Hanja for many years as they adopted it for their language early on in history. It was only somewhat great. There were quite a few problems in this early version of Korean, and they did try to reform it, and it was alright for some time. But all that changed when one man stepped in to change the game forever. King Sejong the Great, father of Korean rain measuring, avid meat lover, and a bunch of other stuff, including inventing Hangul. So in 1443, Sejong the Great was faced with a problem. Chinese characters are too complicated and literacy was low. Fuck. To fix that, he invented a new syllabic system where you combine consonants and vowels and turn them into sounds. It's literally the easiest shit ever. Banana, Coca-Cola. It was perfect, and also fixed Korean's linguistic problems as well. They used a Hanja Hangul mix for years. This all changed in the 20th century though, when A, the Korean typewriter was invented and they couldn't fit all those Hanja in there, so they started to publish newspapers without it. B, like 20% of Korea after 1945 was illiterate, and by the 70s it was back to 98% because Hangul was so easy. But because the masses didn't really have the time or opportunity to learn Hanja, books, newspapers, restaurant menus, and basically everything else has to adopt to this new change of available knowledge. Because as the government, you want to make your propaganda at least readable, you know? And C, I don't know how true this is, but according to President.jp, there was kind of a sentiment against Chinese characters after, the attempted assimilation by the Japanese. And rebuilding, Hangul became a major part of their national identity. They reformed Korea in a way so that Hangul would be the only writing system in Korea, and by the 2000s, Hanja basically ceased to exist outside of obvious things like ramen, I guess. So that's the basics of Korean Hanja history. Now let's move on to Vietnam, where, surprise surprise, didn't start off with their script looking European. So the history of Vietnamese literature mostly begins when the Red River Delta region was incorporated into the Han Dynasty. RIP Nan Yue. With this conquest came Sino-culture, Sino-knowledge, and most importantly, Chinese characters, or Chu Han in Vietnamese. And basically, it was like this for a huge deal of Vietnamese history. Everything was written Chinese. And along the way, a different writing system, Chu Nam, was invented around the 10th or 11th century as a way of recording Vietnamese cultural stuff like folk songs, folk stories, while keeping Vietnamese characteristics like intonation and vocabulary. Chu Nam was rising in relevance when it was curb stomped by the Ming Dynasty, when records and presses were all destroyed in what I like to call a fucking tragedy. But then after that, it was more or less safe as a script. Chu Nam even experienced a golden age and was recognized as an official language during the Taishan dynasty. Both scripts were used for their own purposes when holy shit's the Portuguese! They tried to spread this dank-ass Roman script called Quoc Ng, but it was only used by certain Catholics and wasn't growing that quick. And then holy shit's the French! And they're actually here to fuck shit up. One thing you should know before I talk about the Romanization transition is that up to this point, many people were illiterate because to understand Chu Nam, Chu Han was pretty much required. And also, education was only accessible to the rich, so literacy was reserved to those who never touched a yak before. Chu Nam and Chu Han were so irrelevant to the masses that the French colonists, Vietnamese nationalists, and the king basically all said, Chinese characters aren't working. This new system will benefit us in the long run. Trust me. So they turned over to Quoc Nguyen. By the 1920s, it was the de facto script and everybody started to use it. And yeah, that's essentially Vietnamese script history, simplified and with excellent pronunciation. If this script was still in use today, it would totally be the hardest out of all the languages. Period. Not only is pronunciation complicated as hell, but Chu Nam contains characters that literally look like some alternate universe shit. That's all I really want to talk about when it comes to scripts. But other countries I should mention that do use Chinese scripts are Malaysia and Singapore, who use both a Latin script and a Chinese script just because Chinese is so prominent there. I should also mention Vancouver as well, am I right, chat? Anyways, that's basically it for this episode. Eventually, I'll be doing a part 2 of this saga with dialects and regional variants, but as of right now, I'm like 7 pages deep into this script, and I feel like if I write any more, I'll have to draw slides until February, so you know how it is. This has been just a brief overview, but if you have something to say or just want to mention a cool fact, please type them in the comments. Thanks for watching. I friggin' love you, man. 川の流れのように緩やかにいくつも時代は過ぎて川の流れのように